stats for the year 2020. These are the most up-to-date stats available on the ONS, and wherever possible I've tried to use their figures and other such official government statistics. UK births, a bit of context. In 2019 there was in excess of 640,000 live births in the UK. This amounts to a fertility rate of about 1.6, well below the replacement rate. This last year, 2020, the birth rate was there were but 613,936 births, which is a drop and represents a birth rate of 1.56 births per woman. So much for the COVID baby boom. And the number of abortions in 2019 was 207,384. This amounts to 18.6 per 1,000 women, or 1.86%, so a little under 2%. And then in 2020, despite the birth rate going down, it rose to 210,860, which means a 18.2 per 1,000 women, or 1.82%. This drop, despite the absolute number going up, is likely due to the immigration into the UK. And to give you an idea of the scale of this, let's compare it to the tragedy that is the COVID-19 pandemic. If you base it off 28 days, people who have died within 28 days of a positive test, you're at 140,503 over 20 months. So this is the total up until the 16th of October 2021. And then for having COVID on their death certificates, the total is 165,213. Due to this statistic taking a bit longer, the most up-to-date figure is for the 15th of October. I've also used for the 28 days of a positive test the most up-to-date statistics for the date of the death rather than the date that it gets recorded by the ONS. Some ethnic stuff. The ONS always records ethnic stuff on almost anything they record. I've tried colour coordinating it. However, when comparing to the UK population, it is important to note that this is a decade old based off the census, and so take any proportions with a pinch of salt. But I will pause so that you can pause the video and look and compare if you so wish. Who's paying for the abortions? Well, we are. If you're a British taxpayer, you're paying for the abortions. Back in the 80s, it was a more or less 50-50 between private sector, public sector, with a small slither of publicly financed but private sector doctors. However, ever since the 90s, both abortions carried out by NHS hospitals and the private sector have diminished, and now the NHS funded independent sector makes up the vast majority, and the private sector is a tiny slither. There are several different grounds for an abortion. This is, if you want to read through each different grounds, feel free to pause it. But the short answer is, if it's a significant risk, you can abort it whenever. But if it's a small risk, it has to be before the point of viability. And it's just a rephrasing of these different emphases. How is this affecting the birth rate? So let's go back to the 2019 I'm using 2019 as the rest of the figures used for this estimate are like trying to get blood from a stone, and I had this prepared earlier. 207,000 abortions and only 640,000 births. The fertility rate estimate is 1.65 per woman, which means that the conception rate is about 2.18. The amount of stillbirths is quite small, and I unfortunately can't find any official statistics on the amount of miscarriages. But yes, it is very close in 2019 to 25%, and I suspect that 2020 it is 25%. As you can see from this trend, well, this graph, it has been above 20% ever since 1996 or so, but it has oscillated. How many conceptions result in an abortion? Age. In 2010 there were a lot more, well, a higher proportion of the abortions were for younger women, and then this has shifted older. However, this is likely due to the older women tending to take a bigger proportion of the amount of births that happen in society now. Poorer people have more abortions than wealthier people. So every year 4.5% of the poorest in society that are between 20 and 24 have an abortion. And then it declines. Interestingly, however, if you compare the actual birth rates by age, especially if you look at the right, which is the present date, and the right on this graph, well, just the right graph, you'll see that in terms of abortions, it's the first half of the 20s, then the second half of their 20s, then people in their 30s, followed by the latter half of their 30s, then teenagers, then people in their 40s. Wherever you look at the birth certificates, back in the 60s, you did have the bulk of births being to mothers in their 20s, with the first half and second half of their 20s more or less quite close together. However, the two lines separated ever since the 70s, and births to women in their 30s has been rising ever since the 70s as well. So much so that since the 2000s, women in their 30s are now early 30s now make the majority of mothers, followed by people in their late 20s, and interestingly, people in their late 30s now make up a higher proportion of those giving birth each year than people in their early 20s. And interestingly, 42% of women that undergo an abortion have had one before, and this is an increase from 2010 when it was as low as 34%. So 2/5 have had one before, whereas a decade ago it was but a third. Thank you for taking so much of your time. I hope this was informative, interesting, and not too depressing, and that whatever your beliefs on this issue, that it will be useful in coming to whatever conclusions you eventually come to.